his life in West Newton. Gene, tell me, if you can, a little bit about your family's background.
My father was born in Cork, Ireland, came to this country as a boy. Before the turn of the century, settled in West Newton. My mother was born in New Brunswick, Canada, came to this country as a young lady for the very simple reason there were inadequate opportunities for young folks in New Brunswick to obtain employment. She happened to settle here in Newton also. I was born here in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Boston in 1915 and always lived in West Newton. My father, through a succession of jobs, working in the mills in Nonanton, and even at one time going around helping the lamplighter light the lights in the evening and put them out in the morning, finally landed a job with the Middlesex and Boston Street Railway Company, where for many years he was a conductor and then a motorman on the two-men cars which they had in those days, up until about the end of the 1920s, when the heyday of streetcars in Newton had passed its zenith and buses began to make their appearance. He became a bus driver and was employed as such until approximately the end of the 1940s, and he worked for the Middlesex and Boston Street Railway Company for some 46 years. My mother more or less spent her time at home because we had 7 children in the family. We had 6 brothers of us and 1 sister. We went to the Newton Public Schools, the older of us, and then the St. Bernard's Parish developed a parochial school. Some of the younger siblings attended the parochial school. I went through the school system when it was more or less a very, very small system. We had the old teachers who lived close to the school. We went to the old schools. I went to the old Franklin School on River Street in West Newton, where there was a very strict rule that if you ran up or down the stairs, you'd be expelled because the condition of the building was so poor. They were afraid of collapses of stairs or ceilings of that nature.
Well, you mentioned your father had many different jobs, working his way up. As an immigrant himself, what age did he come to this country?
He came to this country when he was below or beneath 10 years of age. His family all came over and they settled here. Probably the reason they settled in Newton, there was quite a family grouping over here, and many Irish people had landed in Boston and had sort of gravitated, you might say, to West Newton. The Irish were a predominant ethnic race or factor in Newton at that time.
His choices of occupation, were they directed from his family? Had his father worked in the mills, perhaps?
No, it was just one of those things. There wasn't all that much opportunity for the young men of Irish background. In fact, in my own day, I still can recall one local drugstore in West Newton that had a sign in the window, "Help wanted, no Irish Catholics need apply." I merely mention that not out of bitterness, of vindictiveness, but merely to show that the avenues of employment for young Irish immigrants were fairly narrow at that time. I had even talked at one time with the late Governor James Michael Curley, who told me a major reason he had entered politics was, when he was a young man, about the best job a young Irish Catholic person could get would be driving a tip cart or some laborer's job. And he said he was going to do his best to overcome that and make more opportunities available for the various ethnic groups.
Did your father or mother ever relate stories of discrimination or attitude towards Irish less than favorable?
No, not really. I wouldn't say that. They were rather reticent to speak about anything of that nature. We never had any conversations at home that would be directed towards or against other ethnic groups or oppression or anything of that nature. They were pretty philosophical and took the situation as it came and tried to keep us clear and free from any prejudices.
You mentioned that most of your brothers and sisters and yourself all went to the public schools and later soon to St. Bernard's Parish Croker School. Did your parents favor education? Did they really see its advantage?
As I look back, I don't really think they grasped its significance in the larger measure. We were never importuned to go beyond high school. We were still in that age when not everybody in my age group even finished high school. And there was no pressure to go. We always, as children, tried to do our best in school. Fortunately, we were blessed with a pretty good intellect and all managed to come out pretty well. But in my day, why, college was for the more affluent than we were.
And there was no consideration of it?
No, absolutely none. No talk of it. On the other hand, or conversely, I would say that if on my own, if I or any of my siblings had wanted to go to college, there would not have been any holding us back. We would have had to make it on our own, and simply with no funds available. In those days, scholarships were non-existent.
So you finished high school probably in the mid-30s.
1933, right in almost the low point of the Depression.
So, earning your livelihood, how did you commence?
A very good question. Recognizing at a very early age that we all had to pitch in, I started out at about 9 years of age and worked after school and on Saturdays at the forerunner of the now First National stores. I was sort of a delivery boy and worked in the store doing all the chores that nobody else had time for, and then delivered orders in a little cart. In the summertime, as I got a little bit older, I became a golf course caddy. I did
at Braeburn here?
At Braeburn, yes. And then I would revert back in the winter to working after school for the magnificent sum of 10 cents an hour in the store, and around 50 cents a 18-hole round as a golf course caddy. I was happy to do that because while it doesn't seem like much money, by the same token, the prices were extremely low at that time. The only thing I might comment on in that respect was at the end of the week we rarely ever had any extra money. We got by, but there was no such thing as building up a fund or saving a lot of money.
So this 10 cents per hour and this 50 cents per round went to the family?
Went to the family. In later years, I would keep 25% of the whatever I earned for spending money and for savings.
Were you one of the older in the family?
I was the oldest of 7 children, yes.
And was this pattern continued with your brothers and sisters?
Pretty much
contributing?
so. It was a way of life with not only our family, but all the families that we knew. Everybody who could did his share in helping to support and round out the family income and family funds.
Which area of West Newton were you living in at this time?
At the particular time, I lived on Cherry Street from 1915 until 1925. We rented an upstairs apartment in a two-family dwelling. 1925, our landlord decided he was going to move into our apartment, so we had no choice but to get out, and at that point, we bought a home around the corner down on Henshaw Street, home of the late Postmaster Stacy, who was postmaster in West Newton. And we lived in that home. I lived there until I returned from service in World War II.
So after high school and a permanent job, how did you look for one of those?
I trudged the streets of Boston for some months. It was more or less futile because for every job opening there probably were 1,000 applicants. Didn't matter how menial the work of the job was, there were thousands of applicants. One day I happened to walk into the Clapper Company, then known as New England Toro Company, next to the State Armory in West Newton, the site of the old street railway car barn operated for many years by the Middlesex and Boston Street Railway. That was a fledgling company which was a specialty distributor of outdoor power equipment to golf courses, cemeteries, park departments, schools, and the like. And in those days, there was no such thing as a list of equipment for homeowners. Homeowners pushed a lawnmower, they shoveled snow, they didn't have any of the modern contrivances, so fortunately I was able to obtain employment there. Worked about 50 to 60 hours a week, made $10.50 a week for some years, but I considered myself fortunate when all day long we would have people coming in asking for us even for an hour's work. And you must bear in mind, when we talk of those days, there was no such thing as unemployment compensation. There was no such thing as Social Security, and there were no food stamps, no organized relief, nothing. You either worked or you went hungry or your family took care of you. They did have the poorhouses for the really down and out indigents, but people were ashamed to admit they had to look for public relief in those days. So I worked there and was happy and contented to be getting a regular weekly pay.
Now, what was your task at the Clapper Company?
In those days, before the name was changed, it was called New England Toro Company. I was a general office worker. I did, you might say, everything in an office capacity other than bookkeeping. We had a bookkeeper who handled all the books. And I was assistant and became, after a few years, vice president of the company. It began to really grow as the years went on. I did a good deal of sales work, general office work, typing, answering telephones, doing the buying. In other words, I received a second education in business right from my job.
Other than your job, what other activities did you do when you were working 50, 60 hours a week, but your spare time?
My spare time, I was always sort of an outgoing sort of person, and I became involved in community affairs. I early got into community chest work and reached the highest point I reached, and that was serving as assistant village chairman of the residential the area in West Newton. I became at an early age extremely interested in politics and joined the Democratic Ward and City Committee. We were sort of outcast at the time because Newton was perhaps the strongest Republican city in the whole state, and I received a very liberal education, like ringing doorbells and doing all the legwork, assisting other candidates, working on the late President Roosevelt's campaigns, which were very, very dominant in the 30s. I became active in church affairs, sang in the choir at St. Bernard's Church, and those are the main outside activities I had. I did play golf and continued to skate and things of that nature, but I got into more and more outside community activities as I went along.
With some of these activities, like you mentioned skating, you were involved in athletics at Newton schools?
No, that's a very good question. I'd always hoped to become active in athletics because I took part in the West Newton Community Center. We had informal athletic activities, but I guess I kept my nose to the grindstone in that as I mentioned earlier, worked after school, and I decided I would take sort of a sabbatical from work in my senior year at Newton High School. I went out for the basketball team. I played a lot of informal basketball, something I was relatively adept at, and I guess the fates were against me because we just about got into the midst of the practice sessions when two of my brothers came down with scarlet fever. And in those days, it's unheard of today, but the Board of Health came around and put up the red sign, and anybody who was caught inside the house when the sign went up was there till the disease had run its course. So I missed 3 to 4 weeks of school. And by the time I get back, the basketball team had already been picked, so I just went back to work.
You mentioned the singing in the choir. Did you find that the membership in the parish meant a great deal to people in West Newton?
I would say it did, because in those days we did not have a mobile society. People were pretty well set. In those days, it really was in the almost infancy of the automobile business. Very few people had cars at that time, and there seemed to be an ongoing continuity of families. Everybody knew everybody else, not only in our parish, but in all other denominations and churches in the city. I became also active in connection with the parish with the old organization known as the Newton Catholic Club, which was an organization of men from the various parishes, Catholic parishes in the city, under the aegis, guidance of the pastor of St. Bernard's Church. And I became a officer and secretary of the club. We had great times then because it was sort of the center of a great deal of the social activity at very low cost. Dues were very, very nominal, $4 a year. We had 4 bowling alleys, 2 pool tables, a billiard table. We put on minstrel shows, musicals. We ran card games. We ran field days. And in general, it was a good meeting place for the people outside of actual church activities.
And which gets us back to politics. Indirectly, because oftentimes the church groups in politics are mixed. Is that happen in your case also?
My case, I ran and on my own, so to speak. I did not seek and would not countenance being supported by a church or any church. I never made any reference in my political life to any affiliation with any church society, something I personally frown on. In other words, I stand on my own, and I never did mention that whatsoever.
So your political activity evolved. Did your work helpful in it? Meeting people and getting involved?
Not my daily occupation, not so much, but becoming involved in helping other candidates, ringing doorbells, registering voters, taking part in the campaigns of other more experienced people, and I found thoroughly enjoyable and intriguing, and something I felt I'd like to try myself. And in 1939, I announced my candidacy early in the year for the position of Ward Alderman in Ward 3 of the city of Newton. In those days, for somebody such as I to announce for Alderman would be a bold step at best, and my chances of being elected were remote, so most people thought. However, for the experience I'd gained over the years, I was able to keep a campaign going at the appropriate times, and with plenty of help from people that I had been associated with in politics, I was successful in polls in November 1939. At that time, although Newton was and still is, at least on paper, a nonpartisan city as far as municipal elections go, it was predominantly a Republican city, and I was one of 2 or 3 Democrat-affiliated members of the Board of Aldermen. Assumed my seat on January 1st, 1940. I still can see the gentlemen up there in those days. They were all men. Very, very fine, high-minded men whose main interest was the city, the welfare, and whatever was good for the city was good for them. They had no ulterior motives. They considered serving as a public duty. They ran a good city, and I was very proud to have been associated with them. Our philosophies of life basically were different, but we had each other's respect.
As probably one of the first Democrats as such,
yes,
even nonpartisan, did that make your job more difficult?
Extremely so. It's a very perceptive question you're asking, because I can still hear at around midnight most of the aldermen would say, well, I got to get up early in the morning, I'll be leaving. And I always stayed, because that was the time when if anything was going to be put across, it would not be on the docket as the list of items was known as. It would be brought out then. And there were always enough of the other crowd stayed to make sure their point was well taken. So I had to stay all the time. And I would be there more or less in the sense watching to see what would go on, and then I'd walk home maybe 3, 4 o'clock in the morning across West Newton Hill in the dark. All street lights in the city went out automatically at 1 o'clock in
Now, the elections are still nonpartisan, but there's quite a few Democrats who are getting elected. That indicates that there have been some great changes that have happened in West Newton in your lifetime. Maybe you could point to some of those changes?
Yes, very, very much so. West Newton Hill, where we're seated right now, for instance, was a section of the city that was not that well or as heavily built up as it is today. The estates were very large. For example, from the corner of Commonwealth Avenue and Temple Street, there were but 2 homes over to the next street. One was occupied by the Dowse family, who were Mrs. Sinclair Weeks was a Dowse girl. The next house was occupied by a family named Fitzgerald on the site of the present Pierce School, where husband, wife, and 9 daughters lived. And that was more or less typical of West Newton Hill. There weren't all that many homes. There were very large estates. And for the most part, it was the stronghold of the WASPs. Fine people, good, decent living people. Also, in my younger days, you might say that West Newton offered a bucolic taste. It was not quite in its pristine early stages, but it was more or less country. There was even a dairy farm at the other Waltham end of Cherry Street. And there were perhaps as many fields and other open spaces as there were homes. The north side of Washington Street was occupied mainly by middle-class working people. There was a strong sprinkling of Irish people, and then there's, when I was a child, more and more Italian people came into the city. And as I entered the Board of Aldermen, it was obvious that more and more people of the Jewish background were coming into Newton and into certain areas of West Newton. A reverse change was the so-called colored village, which even the blacks referred to in those days, located behind the old fire station in West Newton and St. Bernard's Church. There were perhaps 600 or 700 black people lived up in that area. And with the coming of the toll road extension, their homes were virtually taken from them. They were wrecked and they were compensated for the loss of their homes. But in essence, it destroyed that ethnic neighborhood. Still up there, but on a very modest scale. Those people were pretty well spread through Newton and also in the surrounding communities. But as we know it, the village no longer really exists as it did in those days. We've seen virtually every open space, every field built up, streets built where there were nothing but cow pastures in my time. Many, many people on the north side of Cherry Street kept cows, horses, chickens, turkeys, goats, and sheep. All long gone.
Gene, while you were busy working and all, did you have other pursuits also?
Yes, somehow or other, whether it's fate or something else, I found time to take an occasional vacation, although it was 3 years before I was eligible for a short vacation of 1 week, and after at my own expense a second, I took a trip to New Brunswick where I met the future Mrs. Cronin, and we kept in touch with each other over the years. She finished school and went on to Montreal, where she trained at St. Mary's Hospital to become a nurse. I went to work and all, and after getting into the service, we decided perhaps it was time to get married, which we did on June 19th, 1944. My wife, Kay, then came to the United States with me, and accompanied me down south while I went through officers candidate school. She returned to West Newton, and after the war was all over, I came back, and we've lived in West Newton ever since. Now we're at the point where we have raised 7 children. Our youngest, Eileen, is 21. She is a junior at McGill University in Montreal. So we've seen most of them through school and on their way towards their own objectives or goals in life.
So it was a service that interrupted your political career.
Yes. I served on the Board of Aldermen until I tendered my resignation in August 1942. Although under the existing state law at that time, a member of a municipal Board of Aldermen or City Council was entitled to retain his seat as long as he served in the armed forces. However, while some did that, follow that course, I didn't feel there was any way I could properly represent the constituents while serving in the armed forces during the war, so I tendered my resignation. And having come back and been busy with a young and growing family, while I maintained an interest in politics, I have pretty well refrained from becoming actively involved in an elected capacity. Although I did serve at the request of the then Mayor Howard Whitmore as a member of the Board of Public Welfare in the city for some 12 years until the state took over the administration from cities and towns of all public welfare activities.
What were the difficulties, what were the things you enjoyed about raising a family in West Newton? What did West Newton have to offer?
West Newton was centrally located to just about every advantage that you would want to give your children. It had good schools. It was close to all the facilities and the background that you might want for special trips and all of that. It had good educational facilities. It had good backup library facilities. It had good playground facilities. It was a safe place in which to raise children. In other words, it had about everything that you could ask for to help you properly raise a family to its fullest potential.
Gene, there's a similarity here. You say that you and your wife have raised 7 children, and your parents raised 7 children. Both of this all happened in West Newton. Maybe you could compare and contrast what it was like for you to raise your family as to how your parents raised their family.
It makes for an interesting comparison. Perhaps the analogy would be that raising a family in my time versus my parents' time would be the same as growing up in, as I did in the old days in West Newton of 50, 60 years ago versus the times of the 50s and the 60s. We lived, as did most people that I knew, in homes that had no central heating. There was no air conditioning, and little or no refrigeration. We used ice boxes. We got our ice every day, depending on how much we used the day before. Today, of course, and when my children were growing up, we had central heat, a certain amount of air conditioning. Everybody had a refrigerator. Everybody had or has a television and radios. In my day, we made our own entertainment. We had gas lights until I was in high school. We were one of the few families in the area. In my growing up time as a boy, we had a telephone in the area. We were sort of the neighborhood's telephone booth. And today, of course, virtually every one of our children had a radio in his room or in his hand. And television, of course, is commonplace. Our children almost can't imagine what it was like not to see television. The foodstuffs, as I say, we couldn't store that much. There was no way really that you could buy, for example, ice cream and hope to keep it. Even with an ice box, it wouldn't last that long. You almost had to buy it for the meal you were going to use it. Clothing, similarly, we had the staples in clothing, and today with all the new materials they use, the kids could more or less get new clothes, new suits, and new dresses right along. We passed ours all down. We had coal heat in our home. We used coal. I can still remember occasionally in the wintertime picking up lumps of coal that would fall off the pungs, which were the sleighs that delivered the coal. Oil heat was not heard of in my time. I can't remember anybody I knew as a growing boy who had oil or gas heat. And today, why, with central heating and conveniences, electric lights, it's a different world completely for the children. School systems are much more advanced. The opportunities to go on to higher education are unlimited for young people. In my time, you get your family all through high school, why, that was a major accomplishment for the parents. There was as much difference as day is from night, and perhaps when my children have their own families and look back 40, 50 years from now, they'll be singing the same tune.
Do you think the structure of the family has changed? Is family life as important to your parents' family as it was to your family?
The structure of family life certainly has changed, and I describe that basically to the mobility we have primarily in the automobile has made us a nation of movers. And a phenomenon which still doesn't set too well is the tendency or the feeling of the young people today that they have to get out and be on their own as soon as they get to be about 18 years old. They have to get out and learn. Of course, they're like the fledglings leaving the nest. Sooner or later, they can, will, and should, but we've always felt their getting out was a little bit premature. In the old days, people more or less tended to stay as a family unit.
You stayed
Yes.
at home until you were married?
We stayed at home and basically until we were married. There was, if you got out and got into your own apartment, people wondered what was wrong with you.
The question of mobility, the ease of it today, has that changed the sense of community in West Newton, do you think?
Yes, very, very much so, because with the ease of mobility today, it's nothing to go from here to Cape Cod in a matter of an hour, hour and a half. In my day, if you wanted to go to the Cape, you took a train from Boston, and it was a half a day's trip to get down there and a half a day's trip to get back, which meant that very few other than the really wealthy people went to the Cape. To get even 25, 30 years ago, before Route 128 came through, to get from here to the North Shore to Gloucester was a big job in itself. You just can't visualize how it was in those days too. Most of the streets in Newton were dirt roads. And to get from here to any place, you went through the business sections. I can remember when people are more or less incredulous when I tell them that when I was a boy, Route 128 came down through Needham, came right down Chestnut Street into West Newton Square, made an abrupt left onto Washington Street, and then darted down Waltham Street past Calvary Cemetery and on out through the business sections of Waltham and Lexington and Woburn and all of those. So it has made quite a change. There's a tendency for people to always be on the go. They go away for the entire summer, where the old days they might take a brief vacation of a day or so, or it was unusual for a family to go away for an extended period of time in the summer. In those days, we had a more cohesive family unit, which in turn meant the community was more or less together most of the time. We don't have that today.
A lot of your entertainment and activities and recreation was centered in West Newton.
Centered in
You
West
mentioned
Newton.
earlier a community center that you participated in.
Community center I participated in, and it's now the forerunner of the Newton Community Service Centers, which is a big operation today, almost big business. Perhaps, and this should be brought into the conversation, I think at this time, one of the highlights and the local place where we were delighted to go to was Norumbega Park in Auburndale. Each year, the last week of May, the Middlesex and Boston Street Railway Company would make available to every school student in Newton bus or trolley car tickets to and from Norumbega Park, and free admission to the park, and maybe 25 cents towards refreshments and free rides to open up their season. That was a banner day, and it was a crowded day. Everybody took advantage of that. At that time, too, Norumbega Park had quite a zoo up there, not just a bear or two, but a real zoo, most of which later was transported up to Hudson, New Hampshire. The Benson's Animal Farm became the nucleus and sat of Benson's Animal Farm. And they had a theater before the famed Totem Pole Ballroom, where there were vaudeville acts and the old-time movies and free acts in the summer. And on Sunday afternoons at the bandstand at Norumbega Park, why we enjoyed an old-time band concert every Sunday afternoon.
You did that as a family?
We did that as a family.
Your father must have got a few extra passes for...
Yes. My father, as an employee of the Middlesex and Boston Street Railway, had a generous supply of passes all the time for the park, because the park was owned by the Middlesex and Boston Street Railway. As a matter of fact, it was their idea. They built it. When the railway first started, before the turn of the century, they created the park as an inducement for people to ride the trolley cars coming out from the Boston and the surrounding communities.
You mentioned earlier that your family provided their own entertainment. You mentioned singing in the St. Bernard's Choir.
Yes.
Was singing one of the pastimes that you've done in a family setting?
Yes, most families had a piano, and my mother, for example, was an impromptu self-taught piano player. My father played the harmonica very, very well, and he had a nice Irish tenor voice and delighted in singing. It was good entertainment for him and for the entire family.
Both your parents being of Irish descent, was your family interested in Ireland as a nation, or were they mainly interested in finding their place in America?
They were virtually 100% interested in finding their place in the United States, rather than becoming involved in activities pertaining to the old country. My mother, of course, came from Ireland in a sense through Canada. Her people landed in Canada, as did my wife's people from Ireland, and my father and his family had just happened to land in Boston. But looking back on the Irish community of that time, there was very little political or other activity that would be devoted towards the old country. Most of them were so busy just scratching out a living, they frankly didn't have time. They worked hard in those days. They didn't have the conveniences, and they didn't have unions for that part, and they were just lucky to get any kind of a job, and they worked hard. They found their recreations in their family, and you might say in their church.
Were there any ethnic fraternal organizations existing in West Newton, Ancient Order of Hibernians?
Well, they had the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and they were just starting a few of the Italian societies. There was an Odd Fellows Hall. That really was not what you might call an old country organization. Those were the prime ones in the area at the time.
Were any of them helpful in getting people jobs? Was there not a requirement, but would it be helpful if someone was looking for a position to belong to a certain?
Not really, no. It was more or less of a social thing rather than an opportunity or a way of a cutting edge of getting a job. And though I should have perhaps mentioned a little bit earlier too that when we talked about mobility, that in my younger days, a good deal of the mobility had to do with horses. We had two hay, grain, and coal dealers whose big job was, in addition to coal, was supplying the wealthier people of West Newton Hill with hay and grain for their horses. And the horses were used by the city for most of the work on the teams. As I was a young boy, the last of the fire engines with horses operated out of West Newton, and all our coal was delivered by horse and wagon. Milk was delivered by horse and wagon. In the wintertime, one of our great sports was to jump onto the runners of what we call the pungs, the horse-drawn sleighs that delivered coal and hay and grain to the homes. I can still see Tom Lyons, the original Tom Lyons, funeral director, sitting up on the coach and four with the coachman on one of his black hearses drawn by four black horses, directing or leading a funeral from St. Bernard's Church up Cherry Street to Calvary Cemetery. And the old Italian people were accustomed to using a band. Their old Italian funerals were accompanied by Barbo's band, who wore black armbands and literally piped the deceased up Cherry Street up to Calvary Cemetery.
You mentioned the funeral procession. Have the rituals and ceremonies concerning death and dying changed greatly in recent times? Maybe you can compare and contrast the way it was done several years ago.
Yes, very much so. There's a complete change in the custom since I was a young boy. When I was younger, most people were buried from their homes. That is, they were so-called waked from their homes. A crepe, purple crepe, was put on the door. There was an immediate hush in the neighborhood. You almost tiptoed around for 2 or 3 days out of respect for the deceased person and the remaining members of the family. The wakes would be held for 2 or 3 nights, and if I may be so bold as to say so, they were almost like social get-togethers. The neighbors would come in and bring in foodstuffs and pies and donuts and things, of cakes and things of that nature. And the funeral director would more or less move out everything out of the parlor and set the casket in the parlor, make ready for the great number of people who would come to pay last respects. Funeral homes were unheard of in those days. They just did not exist, at least in Newton. They may have had a few in Boston, but not out here. The people, especially the Italian people, would wear, the male members of the family would wear black armbands on their suits, and to a lesser extent the Irish, for a period of up to 1 year after the funeral or the death. And the old Italian ladies would wear black clothes for nearly a year after the death of a family member. The wakes would be held, as I say, and they would become literally social gatherings in that many people would be brought together who would have no occasion or just felt they had no opportunity to see one another, but a death was almost a mandatory call. People came and paid their respects. The funerals were held with rehearsals and horses. I remember also attending the funeral service for the late John Wingate Weeks, who was Secretary of War in Calvin Coolidge's cabinet. Mr. Weeks was brought back to West Newton, and he was laid out in state at the Unitarian Church in West Newton Square. And as a young boy, perhaps not knowing any better, but maybe that's the way kids are, 2 or 3 of us in our old clothes decided if everybody else was going into the church, we'd go in and pay our respects too. So we did go in, and along with dignitaries from all over the world who would come to West Newton for the funeral of that great man. And it just so happened that as we emerged from the church after paying our respects, one of the wire services took our picture and captioned it all over the country with "From the humble to the mighty, pay respects to the late John Wingate Weeks." And those, more or less, they were family affairs, neighborhood affairs, and everybody went to wakes. I can recall many a wake of an old-timer where I'd get there in the evening about 9 o'clock, and the wake went on around the clock, leaving there the next morning 5 or 6 to get time to get to work. It was a great comfort to the family to have their relatives and friends come in to lend a hand in their time of bereavement. Today, it seems that the wakes become shorter and shorter. That first they were half-day wakes, now they're from 2 to 4, 7 to 9, and I've noticed a trend just lately that many people are simply being buried without any wake at all. Just shows the change over a relatively short period of time.
Speaking of death and dying, it brings about what often precedes that, health care. Has health care in the West Newton area changed greatly in your lifetime?
Yes, there's been a radical change in health care over the years. In my younger days, each family had its family doctor. There were perhaps about 7 or 8 of those general practitioners in West Newton, each with its own following. In those days, while doctors held office hours, it was a custom for doctors to make daily rounds, morning rounds with a little black bag, and follow that up in the afternoon with office calls. Today, a house call by a doctor is virtually unheard of. In the old days, the doctor, because perhaps of his caring for the families as he did, not that they don't care today, but in a more obvious, visible sense, was the most highly respected man in the community, stood in the pride of the clergyman. The doctors all had the little caduceus or doctor's cross on the back of their vehicle or car. Today that's non-existent because the doctors fear if they show any signs that the car belongs to a doctor, somebody will rip off the car looking for drugs. Those days too, I can well remember, if you were so unfortunate as to be afflicted with pneumonia, the cynical comment was, call the doctor first, the priest second, and the undertaker third. We didn't have the antibiotics and the modern drugs, which to a great many people have made many of those serious illnesses sadly more serious than a common cold today. We had a very small cottage hospital in those days, and you went to the hospital only if you were really deathly sick or were going to have an operation. There was no such thing as Blue Cross or Blue Shield or hospitalization or health insurance whatsoever. You went and you get out of the hospital just as quickly as you could because while the rates were nominal, frankly, most people had no spare cash. It's, as with everything else, it's been almost a complete metamorphosis in hospital health care.
Well, to take this back a little bit further, birth. How was it, how were your 7 children? How were your parents' 7 children born? And how were your 7 children born?
Our 7 children were all born in hospitals, and my brothers and my one sister likewise were all born in hospitals. I believe that if you go back a little to my wife's people who were in New Brunswick, most of their births were at home. And in Ireland, of course, they probably were all that way at home. But even as a child, I cannot remember any cases that I know of where childbirth took place other than hospital, other than an emergency or a premature birth, something of that nature.
It seems that organization has touched every phase of life in West Newton in your lifetime. How about the simple things like recreation, sports?
It's a very good point, and in my younger days we organized our own sports. As I mentioned in our earlier discussion, a great deal of West Newton consisted of fields and open spaces, so that you might say literally on almost every other street there was a baseball field or plenty of room for a field. We laid out our own ball fields, paced off the bases and all, and many of them we'd run through fields. There were no level grounds such as we have on the playgrounds today, although we did have through the kindness of the city playgrounds, but in the neighborhood we'd lay out our own fields. In my particular neighborhood, through the kindness of the operators, owners of the Allen Military School, which was located on Waltham Street, West Newton, not far above the square. They had 2 ball fields, and when they weren't using them, they allowed us to use those fields. We had pickup teams. There were no such thing as organized leagues. We had great fun. We'd pick up every day, choosing sides. Football was the same way, and in the spring we'd start out, the boys would play marbles, Bear in mind that the sidewalks, almost 100% in those days, were dirt sidewalks, so we'd either sweep holes or sit down and use what they termed setups. Favorite sport of the girls in those days, of course, was hopscotch and a very popular jump rope. For skating in West Newton, we skated at Dolan's Pond, which has now been declared an open conservation area. We put our skates on over in the woods. We used old boxes and Christmas trees to light fires to keep our feet warm with. This was the days before open burning was banned. And we also had West Newton Common. At times when the ground froze deeply enough, the fire department would come, bank up the earth around the common and center field, and they would flood the common, which was a great sport, particularly for the younger children. There were many little local teams and leagues, not city leagues as such, but St. Bernard's Parish and its Newton Catholic Club had a championship ball team for many, many years. One of its rivals was the West Newton Colored Giants, composed of the
Continued on tape 2.